This podcast is sponsored by the GiftDirect's Talks, which has been called the TED Talks for Entrepreneurs. We have this phenomenal guest named Chidester. But before I introduce Tanner, I want to give you a very brief history lesson, only because when Tanner speaks, it'll allow you to say, man, this guy's like insanely talented. What I mean by that is this. For the last 200,000 years, we as human beings were primarily hunter and gatherers, which pretty much everyone was poor. And then 12,000 years ago, there was a place called the Fertile Crescent where people started doing farming. And then a few thousand years ago, you had some royalty. A few hundred years ago, you had these robber barons like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. A few dozen years, you had the Bezos and the Bill Gates and the Steve Jobs. But in the last decade or so, and I know maybe Tanner might think I'm feeding his ego, but I'm not. I'm saying this to you because if all of us are here to make a difference, to make an income, and do well in life, hopefully you learn from Tanner, because it's a very, very rare time frame in our lives where you can literally do well for yourself, for your family, for the community. And when you hear Tanner's success stories in sales, which essentially is persuasion that's measured, I hope you really take stock that what he shares. I've listened to some of his stuff. I was referred by 2 people. So for myself, I just really don't do many interviews anymore, but I just watch some of his content, super cool vibe. But I like that he's so direct. If you're gonna learn from anyone, learn from people that have done what you want to do, but just be very straightforward, because otherwise it's all just like fluff. So that being said, Tanner, thank you so much for being on our podcast. And just share briefly with the guests, the people listening and watching, how'd you get into the whole sales world?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's such a great introduction. I appreciate it. I grew up in a family of 7 kids and 4 sisters, 2 brothers, very religious. I got bullied, I would say, quite a bit as a kid, and that got me into sports. I did sports from 12 to 22. And then I had a mentor who convinced me to drop out of school with a year left. I was actually a petroleum engineer, had a 4.0. I actually worked my ass off to get in the school, but he's like, hey, your goals don't align with that. And I started trying to build a fitness business. That took 2 years. I didn't really make any money, maybe $1,000 a year. It was very bad. I almost considered going back to school. The third year, I figured a couple things out. We can talk about it. And then I started having people ask me to consult them, and things just really took off from there. In addition to that, I did door-to-door sales for about 9 months. And looking back, I didn't realize it was going to help me later in life, but it was a very big silver lining, because mentally, emotionally, physically, that was probably to date the hardest thing I've done, even harder than building my companies. So those 2 things is just trying to build businesses and then doing door-to-door sales, honestly.
Let's talk about that, because someone like Tony Robbins does door-to-door sales, someone like John Paul DeJoy, who's a billionaire, did door-to-door sales. What do you feel, as you said? Because again, I've watched some of your videos. You're like, dude, if all I do is DM 100 people, that's all you have to do. We're supposed to door-to-door sales. What do you feel allowed you to really cut your teeth when you're doing door-to-door sales? Like, bring me back to that time.
Yeah, so when I started, I was very scared. It's hard to describe, but you're walking up to someone's door. It's completely quiet. It's the middle of a day. You can see them inside. You start knocking, and then as they get closer, your heart, starts beating out of your chest. I would say that took me 2 months to get over. A good 2 months knocking 6 days a week. Once I got past that, I think mentally you start realizing nothing's a big deal. There's nothing to be nervous about. They're not going to do anything. You're fine. And I didn't want to waste my time. So I think mentally I got very, I just didn't care. I think that's the best way. I just did not care if they opened the door and pulled a gun on me. They pulled a knife on me. They cut me out. I just didn't
Did that
care.
ever happen though?
Yeah, it did. It did multiple
Really?
times. Yeah, yeah, because you're in pretty rough neighborhoods, and I stuck out like a sore thumb. I was a tall white guy, and I would say most of the neighborhoods I went into, I was not usually in those
So
neighborhoods, I guess.
someone literally pull a gun on you when you're knocking on a door.
Yeah, yeah, but it was more. It didn't. I don't think it was. He did pull a gun, but I wasn't really intimidated, because I think he was trying to intimidate me. I don't think he was going to use it, but he was trying to intimidate me. And I just remember saying, oh, good, that's awesome. This will tell you where to point it, because I was selling alarms.
Really?
Yeah, yeah, because I just had so many things happen. This was probably 4 months in. You just get immune. You just get immune to anything, and you're tired and you're walking around all day. So I didn't want to spend the mental energy. And so that's actually helped me be very efficient in business. Ironically, is I'm very efficient, almost to a fault, because you have a set amount of energy per day, and I don't want to waste any of my
Yeah.
energy. So it actually helped me in that regard.
So let's talk about that energy. Let's talk about the efficiency, because again, my clients, speakers, author, coaches, entrepreneurs, business owners, you're a sales guy. You have done very well for yourself. What are some key principles that you perhaps learned from the door-to-door sales world that has allowed you to do well now? Because you have both like online world and you have offline, but I think the principles you have, the fundamentals, it's not just door-to-door sales, it really applies to everything if you're in business.
Yeah, in person really helps you with tonality, body language. Um, you can read people. I'm very good at reading people. So that helps me a lot on online because if I can see someone's face, I know what's going on. I think without that, it would have taken me much, much longer. And online's a lot easier. And the reason it's easier is when you're knocking on someone's door, they can use any objection you can think of because you're not supposed to be there. When you go to online, you can actually vet and pre-frame. So only people who want to talk to you are talking to. So I find it very, very easy to close because they're actually interested in what I'm selling versus when I sold door to door. They just, I mean, I would hear everything. Some of this stuff they would say wouldn't even make sense. And when my go-to response would just be, that's why I'm here. If I couldn't think of what to say, I just say, that's why I'm here. And it just really helped with that. And it really, I think the biggest thing is just emotionally, that was the hardest thing I've ever done. I didn't get a break for 9 months and I was doing it 6 days a week, 8 hours a day plus. And it just really can break you. But it was in a good way. And when I finished, I was really grateful for it because I think it's helped me generate millions and millions of dollars.
Tell me about that. You know, most people are already broken. Most people don't want to knock on the doors. Maybe it's one day, 1 week, 1 month, and you have like a David Goggins, which is always like stay hard. But at the end of the day, it's like we have those moments, right? But let's talk specifically about some of the languages you use in terms of vetting and pre-framing. I want to give very specific details about that. Like, what do you talk about when you're saying vetting and pre-framing? And what are you actually offering? What are some things that you're offering? So you can feel free to share. What do you help? Who do you help, and how do you help them?
Yeah, so when I started, I sold online fitness programs because that was my upbringing. I did a lot of fitness, Division 1 athlete. Then that did really well. I started winning some of these ClickFunnels awards. You can see those here. And I had trainers start asking me to consult them. And then outside of that, more people started asking. And that's like this one here. It's like Elite CEOs, my main company. So it turned
Mhm.
into business consulting because people started to ask. In terms of vetting, if you reach out to someone via DM, and you get them to book a call, you vetted them, right? So it took what's your goal? What are you struggling with? What have you tried? You got them to that point. Once they book a call, they can fill out an application. And on the application, you can ask questions. The 3 questions I usually tell people they need to have is, can you start right now? Do you need a spouse's permission? Do you have finances? And you can ask that in a million different ways. But if I get that, I'll move them to a sales call. If I don't, I'll follow up and say, hey, your application looked pretty good, but I had a question about this or this. If they give me a good answer, I'll move them through. If they give me a bad answer, I'll cancel. Something that I think would be helpful for people to hear is in door-to-door sales, you don't vet anyone. So I was used to getting 97 no's a day. When you're building a business, that's a great way to stay broke because it's not efficient. So I was taking every single sales call until finally my coach didn't tell me they should have, but I just started canceling calls and only taking the best looks. And all of a sudden I went from terrible closing to amazing. And I was like, oh, so I only need to talk to the people who can actually move forward. I don't just need to talk to everyone for an hour. So that's what I mean by that. And to be frank with you, the biggest issue I see in businesses that are below 100,000 is almost always that. They almost always have a sales rep prematurely. Their application is terrible. They don't know how to qualify properly. And so they're very, very inefficient. And just by fixing the efficiency, sometimes I can double their business. I actually had a client like that recently where she was maxed out on sales calls. She was like 60,000 a month. We cut 30% of her calls and she went to 120,000 and took the same amount of calls. It was just getting the better prospects on the phone who could actually move forward.
It's really about the qualifying, right? Because I always talk about my clients, like my clients, so those who want to be speakers, want to be coaches, build that credibility. And they always have this thing is like, oh, I want more sales. I'm like, again, show me your process of pre-qualifying. Now, are most of your clients online? Because when I first started this interview, I talked about how, again, I don't think people realize how insanely possible it is to be successful online. And kind of like, I think you're in your 30s. It's like, that's your world. I'm like a little bit older than you, a lot older than you actually. But like, tell us about, when you went from door-to-door sales, which is like, it's like freaking this, right? Literally. But I want you to just share with our audience if they haven't bought into the dream of doing a business online, if they don't know that it actually is possible. Because again, I really thought it was all BS when I first started this about 10 years ago. But when you actually genuinely start helping people globally, then it's like, wow. So was there a moment or series of times where like, holy crap, this is real? Like, not obviously the money is great, right? But I really want the people to know this is about the story. It's called the Gifters Podcast because I believe it's a story. For yourself, was there a moment in time where for the people listening to this call, watching, they might not believe it's possible, especially if they're over 40 and over?
Mhm. Yeah, I got into the world probably similar to how it sounds like you did. I had a mentor who he was actually trying to get me to go back to church because I wasn't going to church. And he had made a lot of money online. And I sat down with him and said, we were just talking. He said, what's your goal? And I just remember saying, I want to make an F ton of money. because I didn't come from much. My dad was a teacher. We had 7 kids. It was always a little tight, not bad, but I couldn't get anything extra. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah.
And he said, well, you can build a business online. And that world was completely foreign to me. Lucky enough, he was married to one of Russell Brunson's cousins. Let me come work with him for a year for free. I was basically a free intern, which I probably should have paid him. I mean, I look back now, he was doing me a favor. And he taught me everything about funnels and emails and ads and all these things. And in the beginning, I didn't make money because he did more low ticket stuff, but I didn't really have a big social media presence or money for ads. But eventually I went to high ticket, and all those skills he had taught me previously where I didn't make any money, they started coming into play. And so I grew very quickly. So first 2 years of business, I did 2 grand. And then the last 6, I did 100 million. And most of that was because once I was able to kind of figure it out, it went very quickly because of all those years before where I think I was learning, but I didn't realize I was learning, if that makes sense. So that's how I found out, is I just had a mentor, and I thought it was BS too. I had no one in my family's ever had a business. I went to a Subway. I'm like, how does Subway work? How do they get the food here? How do they charge? Like, I just was the farthest thing away from a business owner you can imagine. But then I learned it and I loved it. And I will say being an engineer has helped me a lot, because in engineering, it's very logical, very straightforward. And I use numbers in business to make decisions very easy for me, so I don't get emotional about it. And it's helped me a lot.
Well, let's unpack some of that, right? So again, you just went from 0 to 100 million in 6 years, right? But let's talk about from 0 to 100 grand, 100 grand to 1 million, 1 million, 10 million, because you talk really fast like me, and I've helped a lot of my clients make a lot of money, but I really want the listeners and the audience to say, okay, $100 million in 6 years. Why are you bothering even coaching?
Yeah.
But really, what was that turning point in your life, or what are some skill sets? Because again, for anyone in the Western world, for them to get the 6 or 7 figures, it's quite possible. Once you
Right.
get to 10 or even $100 million, a little bit different. So I'm just curious, were you spending a lot of money on paid ads? Were you doing JVs, like some of the more specific things that you helped scale to that point?
Sure. So when I started, that's a great question. When I started, I was doing just outreach, and I got to
Like
50,000.
DMs on Instagram, DMs on Facebook?
DMs on Instagram mostly. And I got to $50,000 a month just doing that. Granted, when people hear that, I was working all the time. When I say, and I'm not exaggerating, like all the time. Once I got there, I realized I couldn't scale any further because I'd maxed out. And so I started learning paid ads. It took me about 6 months. But once I hit it, I just scaled extremely quickly. A lot of people, I think, when they get into paid traffic, they're a little scared. And to me, it was super easy because I was like, hey, I spent 3, I made 10. Okay, if I spend 6, I should make,
But you did it yourself though? You did your own paid
up to
ads?
20,000. So I went up to 20,000 myself, and then I was maxed out on time. So I brought in a media buyer. And that media buyer, actually, I don't know if you know him, but his name's Ashton Shanks. He's one of the better ones, I would say, in the industry. He scaled me to over $1 million a month. And then eventually he went off and did his own thing. But yeah, I mean, I basically was doing everything in my business in the beginning to about around, give or take, like I had a couple employees to 100,000, but once you get to 100,000 a month, it's impossible. So once I did that, that's when I started getting people asking me for consulting help. And then I just kept adding on services, kept adding on services. And those services went from, my fitness service was about 3,200 for 4 months. The business consulting, I could charge 10K. So I could be way more aggressive on the ads. You also keep in mind, when COVID happened, my business went up even more because there were more people looking for it. So I think it was a lot of hard work, and it was a little bit of luck. And, sometimes you're just in the right place at the right time. So when COVID happened, my business was already cranking. I had a huge staff, and that was actually one of the most profitable times in my business. I actually felt bad because I remember seeing people going out of business, and I was making more money than ever.
Yeah. So again, I want to make sure that people hear what you're saying. So like the paid ads at one point for sure, because once you go the more hard work time, you have to get to a certain point where you're scaling into paid ads. And then from the paid ads part, when did you start bringing on a sales team at one point? At what point?
Yeah. So the sales team, I mean, at 100 grand, I brought on a sales rep. Once I had that first sales rep, you just max them out. Usually most sales reps, depending, can do about 250 to $400,000 of revenue. 400,000, they're a freak. 25,000's, I would say, an average rep. They're working pretty hard. So that's how I did it. And then I just scaled accordingly. As the business scaled, I bring on a new rep. But something for people to note is, if you have more sales reps than that, if let's say you're doing $1 million a month and you have 8 sales reps, that's an inefficiency issue. You really shouldn't need to have more than 1 sales rep for 250 minimum. And that's kind of the rule of thumb I'll give people, at least in the high ticket space, right? If you're selling a 5K plus package, that's kind of the barometer I go for.
And do you recommend that people focus more on high ticket type stuff, like over 10 grand and higher?
I do. When I watch Shark Tank, I feel terrible because these people entire lives are on the line. I mean, they've mortgaged their house, they've taken out loans. Yeah, you could hit it big, but if you're looking at what's the highest chance of success, it's much easier to sell 3 people at 3 grand than 100 people at $30.
Hmm.
And for my first 2 years, I did low ticket and had no success. And then I did $1 million in a year after I did high ticket. I think low ticket is better once you have money. Once you've maybe sold a business or you have millions in the bank, then you can go mass market. But I think that's a big mistake for beginners is they have no money, they have no social media presence. And so they can't get out of their situation because $50 doesn't change anything, but 3 grand will, or 6 grand will. And so I'm a big proponent of high ticket unless that person has a very big audience already, or they've already had some success with it, which is rare. Most people are beginners.
Yeah. So you're at a point now where you have your awards, you've been doing this for a while. But a question I get asked often is because I teach people how do you easily find high paying clients. Where to put on networking billionaires, so I've been doing this for literally over 20 years. And they ask me this quick question, which I'm going to ask you, which is, well, how do I convince someone to pay me for a high ticket offer when that person might actually have more experience than I am, Like when you've just started reaching that $1 or $10 million mark, if that person legitimately was more successful than you, but you're selling him or her a high ticket offer, how do you actually do that? Because that's actually a really good question that someone asked me.
I think the answer would be you wouldn't. If you should be somewhat of an expert in what you sell. So when I sold fitness, I have fitness pictures where I was 5% body fat. I'd done some professional modeling. When I started selling business consulting, I built $1 million company and people were asking me, if
Mhm.
you don't feel that you have enough skill, or for example, you said someone has more skill in that area, I don't even think they'd ask. It wouldn't make sense to me that someone who's super shredded would say, hey, Tanner, you're out of shape. Can I pay
Yeah,
you?
yeah,
So I usually would say, if that's how you feel, that's not the right client, but there's a ton of other clients who would have less expertise. You only have to be one step ahead, but I don't think I've ever had anyone pay me who was ahead of me. Right. And
well, let me, I'll be even more specific then, because she was actually a wealth manager. And so
uh,
she's trying to find these multimillionaires who, again, they were actually a higher net worth than she was, but she was a wealth manager. So that's a good question. So that's
so
even more, yeah,
yeah, so that makes much more sense.
yeah,
So
yeah.
in her case, that's all she's going to be going after. So I think you would have to have some type of proof to show that what you're doing is good. So I'll give you an example. Most of the people I've invested with usually are friends of my dad's, and they were able to show me a very ridiculous track record. Now, in the beginning, that's tough, and I understand that. But I would just say for me, I'm not going to give my hard-earned money to someone that can't show me that
Hmm.
and maybe doesn't know someone that I know. So the two things I would work on is if there's someone you want to get in your circle, find someone who's close to them so that when you bring it up, they're like, oh yeah, this is a good person. That plays a huge role, much bigger with higher level transactions. And then number two is have some type of track record. And if you don't, that's okay. I would just say it'll be much harder because that's what high level people are going to ask, like, why you, why not someone
Yeah,
else,
yeah, yeah.
why should I invest this with you, and how do I know I'm going to get a return? So if you can't answer those questions, you either need to come up with an answer for it or come back to it later. Either one's fine, but to think they're not going to ask that would be silly. So you have to have answers to those questions.
Yeah. And for you, in terms of getting more lead flow, do you recommend speaking, going out on more events, or like right now, is it primarily your current lead flow? Is it primarily still paid ads, or do you go out there and speak, or do you have JVs?
I mostly do paid ads. I could do other stuff, I'm sure. I just never did JVs because I don't know. I just didn't want to deal with the hassle. Events is kind of the same thing. Maybe you could say I'm lazy in that aspect. I worked really hard, but I don't want to go set up events and do all this stuff. It's a ton of work.
Yeah.
And so anytime I can run ads just to a VSL or a DM or something like that and
So
get
you pretty
people.
much run ads to a VSL or a DM, and from there you have a sales team to close them.
Yeah, but with that being said, I was on a podcast last week and the gentleman was doing 1.8 million a month. He actually showed me the bank statement. I think he really just wanted to like me to know that he was telling the truth, I guess. And they do a lot of events and podcasts. So he goes on very big podcasts and he leverages their traffic and he does events. And so there's a million ways to win. For me, I always liked having stuff I could count on that I was in control of versus, man, I really hope that guy posts me, or I hope he makes me a collaborator in his reel, or I hope enough people show up to the event. That's a great way to make money. Events actually convert much higher, but it's a lot more work to set them up. And I don't know, I just never grew up doing events. And so I think I'm a little bit, I'm good. I don't want to do an event. I'll just sell something online.
Yeah, if it's working, right? Last question I have for you again. You're very successful now. What brings you joy in your business? It's still about only making money, or what like lights you up, gives you a smile on
Yeah.
your face? What's like that? Because people always talk about money, and I get it. Money's cool, money's important, right? But like,
Yeah.
what also drives you other than just the money thing?
Yeah. It's a great question. I had to face that when I hit 1 million in a month. So my goal when I started was to hit $1 million in a month. I remember I saw it out with Billie Jean, if you know who he is, and I was never jealous. I just thought, man, like, what does this guy have that I don't? And so I was really determined to do that. And I hit 1 million in a month, and I had this big party because it was, I mean, it was my whole life mission at that point. I sacrificed 1.5 years of my life. And I remember someone came in and they said, why are you celebrating? Oh, I hit 1 million a month, da da da. And I was feeling myself. And the person looked at me and said, cool. And they turned around. And I don't know what it was about that moment, but I remember thinking, wow, like nobody gives a shit.
Mhm.
And that actually took me down a little bit of depression for a bit because I started thinking, man, if no one cares, then what does it matter if I'm doing all this stuff and I'm sacrificing all these things and whatever. And I think eventually I got to a point where I realized I had to change my mindset and realize that the things I was doing was personal development and fall in love with the personal development. So now I like building businesses because it forces me to become a better person that people will follow. And I think it's one of the best things you can do in personal development that you can do forever. You can't do sports forever, even though I think that works. I'm sure there's other things, but business you can basically do forever. And I get a lot of joy out of pushing myself to do hard things and then like proving I am who I say I am, right? Like I actually am good enough. Because a lot of times people say, oh, I could do that, but I don't want to. And I think
Yeah,
a lot of times they say that because they're scared they're going to fail.
yeah,
And the cool thing is if you push, you'll either get the story, right? You'll hit the goal, or you'll still personally develop from it. And I've never ever had regret about failing. I've only ever had regret about lack of effort. And so my mission in life is just to push as hard as I can to grow as much as I can. And whether I hit the goal or not, I've detached from it. And that actually has made my life a lot better. Because if you're chasing a number, I have very high level friends. Unfortunately, no matter how much I make, it's just there's always
yeah,
someone ahead of you, and
yeah.
you're just never gonna win unless you're Elon. Everyone loses except Elon. I think Elon's even not the
Even Elon, Elon, I've met Elon, I've interviewed Elon. Even Elon even says, "You don't want to be me." Like Elon has
yeah,
really
right.
has a storm in his
Yeah,
head.
he's probably a psycho with how driven he is. So I'm
Yeah.
really in that phase, and I'm starting to build other businesses that I think will help me develop more that are a little different than what I've done the last 6 years. But I get a lot of joy out of it, and I enjoy reading, I enjoy traveling, I enjoy meeting people. I love high level talks. I have some very high level friends that are in my age range. That one of them will be a billionaire next year, and I get a lot out of the conversation. I really enjoy it. Like I actually because it's just so stimulating to
Yeah,
me, and I
yeah.
like being around people like that.
I love Tanner. That's what we're going to end with because again, so many people, like 99% of people are trying to make millions. Even when they make millions, they're like bored oftentimes. Well, that's how I felt when I reached a certain threshold. But I love the fact that you talked about personal development because we're all here to learn and develop. But what I like about you also is that you're leading by example, which I respect a lot because so many people, when I watch them online, and I just want to laugh, but I don't only because why, right? But in your case, your content, your desire to help, and I just like the fact that you're so blunt and direct, which is great. So how can our guests stay in touch with you? How can they learn from you? How can they hire you?
Yeah, honestly, the best way would be shoot me a DM on tanner.chidester and just put the word gifter. So I know you came from this podcast and we can have a conversation. And I'd be happy to help if it makes sense. And if not, it's good. I don't need any more money. So I'll tell you, I can't help you. So that'd be the best way.
Awesome. Tanner, thanks so much for your time. Have a great day.
Thanks for having me.